Good morning to all of you. I'm Kati Haycock with the Education Trust and am delighted to have been asked this morning to moderate a conversation among three fabulously interesting people about one fabulously interesting subject, and that is the race to the top. And joining me this morning are Joanne Weiss from the U.S. Department of Education, who is the director of Race to the Top. On her left, Joel Klein, who is chancellor of that city-state we know as New York City school system, and Paul Reville, who is secretary of education for the state of Massachusetts. And what I'm going to do, just to get us going, for those of you who aren't as focused as others about the details of Race to the Top, is ask Joanne to give us, just to kind of step back from the details and give us a kind of conceptual overview of Race to the Top. What is it we're trying to do here? What are the big pieces? And I want to warn you in advance that for those of you who are inside of Washington, you know the details of this are not all set in concrete. So Joanne will be less able to give you kind of final information on the details than she will to give you sort of the big picture. But my impression is it's actually the big picture that's important here. So Joanne, without further ado, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So yeah, I will give you the big picture, and I'm sure that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A toward the end, and I'm happy to take whatever questions I can. In areas that you're interested in and I didn't touch on enough. So as I think probably all of you are aware, the Race to the Top Fund is a $4.35 billion set aside within the Recovery Act that is designed to incent and reward states for doing large-scale statewide comprehensive reforms across 4 specific areas that were in the statute, and I'll talk about those in a second. But the idea here is that we're looking for states to do the big, bold initiatives. It's not a pick and choose menu. It's comprehensive reform across all of the areas on the theory that what we need in education to really break through and make significant change happen, to really increase the number of students who graduate from high school ready for college and careers, that we need a sort of all fronts assault on the inertia that stalls so many of the education reforms that we've been engaged in over the last several years. Let me just do a little big picture framing first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about each of the 4 reform areas. So the way the competition is designed, and many of you probably saw this from the proposed notice that we sent out, there are 2 types of criteria that we have outlined. There are state reform conditions criteria, and those are the laws, the legal structure, the frameworks within states that are conducive or not to education reform happening. And those are things for which states will earn points in the competition for having accomplishments, so for having laws that are conducive to education reform happening. That is a reward for accomplishments, not for plans, so intentions to change things in the future don't count in that section. That's about what's happened. Then there are state reform plan criteria, and those say, okay, if you win this grant, what are you going to do with the money? And those are the plans that are covered in each of the different 4 reform areas. And it is a very, very sort of broad, flexible pot of funds that have very, very few restrictions on them. And states can use them in whatever ways best meet their needs and their plans for their context. So there are 4 areas in which these reforms are happening. And they are, I think probably most of you know this, so I'm not going to take too much time here, but college-ready standards and assessments is one. The next one is having great teachers and great leaders in every classroom with a particular focus both on evaluation systems and how we know who the great teachers and leaders really are, what we do with that information, how we use it to make decisions, including, very importantly, decisions about trying to make sure that our best teachers and leaders are in the classrooms where they're needed most. The next area is using data to inform instruction, and there's 2 different parts of that. One is the statewide longitudinal data systems that have gotten, a lot of attention and focus through education reform through education grant programs over the past few years. But also instructional improvement systems, those systems at the classroom and school level that help really drive education change and give teachers and principals the information that they need to make good instructional decisions on a day-to-day basis. And then the last area is paying attention to our most persistently underperforming schools, and saying that we have to actually tackle the job of turning around those lowest achieving schools. So it's about identifying which schools those are and putting in place serious plans for significantly turning around those schools. So those are the 4 different reform areas that are covered in the plan. And with that, let me turn it back to Katie and see whether there's any other questions or anything else you wanted me to cover, Katie.
I think it probably makes sense at this point, Joanne, for you just to talk a little bit about why are those big elements the ones you've chosen?
So I think, so first of all, let me say that these big elements are in the statute. So they're the ones that Congress chose, but I will say that they did choose them together with involvement from the department, because we do feel that they're the 4 pillars for education reform. So standards and assessment are the foundation for understanding what for getting rid of the 50 different goalposts that we have in this country and putting together a common set of standards that help us really understand whether we're preparing all of our students to be ready for competing in the global economy that they're going to find themselves in when they get out of college. And assessments, obviously critically important to measure that. The way of implementing the standards is through assessments that actually measure what it is we're trying to achieve. Human capital is something you've been talking about for the past few days here, and I know you all deeply believe that teachers and great leaders are the key levers for change in education, and quality matters enormously and talent matters enormously, so I'm preaching to the choir on that one. And that data is the thing that those teachers and leaders need in order to make intelligent decisions and smartly help each and every one of their students learn what they need to learn. And finally, no system is stronger than its weakest link. And so turning around high-performing schools is in there because it's something that we have been paying way too little attention to for too long. I think many of you know there's 2,000 schools in this country that are producing 50% of the dropouts, and those same schools are producing 75% of the students of color who drop out. And it's just totally unacceptable, and tinkering around the edges is not going to make a difference. As we know, many of these have been failing for decades now. And so just putting it out there in the policy that it's not acceptable and we have to step up to dramatically, dramatically change those schools seems like a moral obligation, if nothing else.
Paul, let me turn to you. You've been a longtime leader in education improvement in Massachusetts in a whole variety of roles, now as the Secretary of Education. Talk to us about how you guys are thinking about race to the top. Most state leaders with the kind of reform credentials you have think about federal initiatives from the standpoint of, are these giving me levers that I didn't have before? So talk to us a little bit about, are these the right levers for you guys as you move forward? And also, what are the extra challenges posed by the current fiscal climate in Massachusetts, which is similar to most other states here?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think it gives us an enormous opportunity in Massachusetts. It's at one level a great carrot to have out there. It's a very reasonable set of points of focus in terms of strategy. We've got lots of different ideas about strategy, but this is a good set and done in a way that's sort of tight in terms of specification, but loose in terms of how you get there. There's a kind of forcing timeline here that creates a sense of urgency. I mean, in a place like Massachusetts, there's often the temptation where we've been doing well comparatively on a number of indicators to fall victim to a kind of complacency. Yeah. Joanne used the word inertia, and there's a sense in which we could, particularly in times of fiscal crisis, rest on our laurels and say we've done enough and we're still leading the nation. And by virtue of having this opportunity out there at the federal level, focused on some smart priorities, with a forcing timeline and with a charge to us to not just talk about your intentions for the next stage, but to talk about what you've actually accomplished, gives us, it re-energizes the whole movement and gives us a sense of urgency. For example, Governor Patrick and I, through our readiness project, had articulated a set of 50 or so strategies designed to build out our education system after a decade and a half of work in Massachusetts. As proud as we are of doing well comparatively, we've got enormous achievement gaps that are persistent, and in some instances even growing, and we're deeply concerned about that. And we've got to build out and strengthen our school system in ways that sometimes it's hard to generate the sense of urgency about. So this gives us an opportunity to focus and energize around that.
Terrific. So Joel, what say you about these particular foci? Are these the right ones for a leader like you?
Yeah, indeed, they've long been the right ones for New York City, and I commend the department, Joanne, Arnie, Congress, all of us who brought us here today. I also think this is an interesting opportunity, and Paul and others sense it, because a lot of what goes on in education goes on in school districts, and the state is often either in a neutral or, quite frankly, in some states I've heard from colleagues, in a negative posture, because they are in the regulatory business, and what we are trying to do is to try to break through lots of regulatory constraints. So my hope is that by focusing on what I think are the key areas, like you can spend forever arguing, did they get it exactly right, or should they put a little more? But it's pretty hard to argue that these four things are in major drivers. And in some respects, all four of them go to what the basic discussion the last couple of days have been about, is how do we set high standards and get the right people to move our kids on an equitable basis across the nation to those standards? I mean, this isn't like rocket science. And it's something we don't like to talk about, because typically those decisions are being made by 50 different states on standards, and literally thousands of different state policies, union contracts, and other things on personnel. And so I think they found a way, so to speak, to take a shot across the bow of the regulatory establishment and to start to drive policy through dollars. Getting the states on board in so many ways can help the districts do the work, because in the end, the work happens in the districts and at the schools. But getting the states on board on these things and doing it in a clever way, which I give them a lot of credit for, which is to say, this is one government program where not everybody is going to be a winner. And by doing that, you put real competitive juice in the system. And the wonderful thing is, particularly, you asked Paul about, in tough economic times, this money even looks more attractive than it might otherwise look. So for all those reasons, this could be a perfect storm if it's implemented and done exactly right, Joanne.
And we're all confident in Joanne, so we're not worried about that part. Well, let me press two of you, you two, on a subject that you kind of raised and kind of didn't, and that is in my experience at least, sort of who's leading reform and who's dragging his or her feet depends on who's in the room in that discussion. When I'm with state leaders, it's quite clear that they think it's mostly district leaders that are dragging their feet. When I'm with district leaders, they often say the things like you just said, Joel, which is states are regulatory, they can't lead. The race to the top is built on an assumption that states will lead, right? And I want both of you to talk from your own perspective about, do states have the capacity to do that? If not, what's standing in the way? And if state leadership is hugely important in actually achieving the goals that we've all set as a country, what do we need to do to build that capacity? Paul, why don't you take that first?
Well, Katie, I've been concerned for a long time about various assumptions that often get made at the federal level about state capacity to execute. I don't think there's a leadership vacuum, at least in Massachusetts. For the past 16 years, the state has really seized the leadership initiative and set high standards and put in place strong assessments and a system of real accountability. I think where we have showed a lack of capacity oftentimes is not having the systems and supports and resources and expertise to work with as many districts as need help to bring them along to meet those high standards. It isn't enough at the state level to simply declare a standard and make the assumption that the districts are going to get there. So we need to build our capacity to make things happen at the local level. At the local level, I think at the same time, we're challenged with resource issues. You alluded to that in your last question, and I was up in Massachusetts yesterday afternoon when I rather would have been here because the governor had to announce a bunch of in-stream cuts to this year's budget, and that becomes a preoccupation at the local level. And there's often a tendency at the local level to look to the state, not so much for leadership or expertise, but to say, you show me the money. And this does provide an opportunity for us to do that. But one of the things I like about this is a kind of vertical integration. Federal government is saying to us as states, come forward and show us your accomplishments and show us bold intentions in terms of what you're aiming at achieving. And in turn, they're saying to us, because much of this money does flow down to the districts and people like Joel, to say, do the same thing to the districts. Say to the districts, and I hope that ultimately the regulations will reinforce are having the authority as a state to insist that local districts step up to a reform agenda that we set at the state level and use that money to execute that agenda, an agenda that we hope will be informed through a local state dialogue. So I think this is helping us build systems of vertical integration, a kind of coherent leadership from the federal level to the state level to the local level.
You know, I don't think, Kay, you can generalize. I really do think there are some states, Paul Pasternak and what he's doing, quite frankly, what Jeb Bush did in Florida, which I think showed real leadership, and I am sure they saw foot dragging at the district and other level. There are other situations, you know, where Mike Bennett and what he did when he was in Denver, Alan Burson, what he was doing when he was in San Diego, and others, where you saw the district out front. So I think it's really a question of leadership and what levels it gets distributed at. My only point is, and I go even beyond Paul, it seems to me you've got to think about what the right functions of various entities are. So for me, I believe the action happens at the school. That's where parents send their kids. So people want to know, is it a great school system? I don't even know what that means. I mean, I've got some of the best schools in the world in New York City, and I've got a lot of schools that no person in this room would rationally choose to send their own children to. And the question is, how do you make sure each of those schools is one that all of you would send your own kids to? And so much of what I think about is what is the function? And if the idea that people very far away from kids are going to come up with some kind of design that they're going to implement on a generic basis, that's not going to work. On the other hand, people very far away from the kids should be setting the standards and the accountabilities. That seems to me to be enormously powerful. And the real challenge is whether the states will help us in implementing the couple of three things here that are going to be difficult. So everybody said, well, you got to equitably distribute high-quality teachers to every school. And we all know, all the data show that the quality of teaching is the most important impact on a kid's education, and kids in the poorest communities, as Kati Haycock and Ed Trust have documented 1,000 times, to the point really where it's a little hard to understand whether people don't read your work or why you keep doing it. But
We don't understand it either.
No. So look, these two what's the most important thing in improving student achievement, the quality or the effectiveness of teachers? And that most important thing is inequitably distributed in America. 55 years after Brown, your zip code is highly correlated with the effectiveness of teachers. Everybody in the audience, nods their head. And the question is, we don't need the federal government or anybody else to tell us that. The question is whether this money will create pathways so that we can get to a different distribution. Let me give you the most simple one. In virtually every school district in America, we pay math and science teachers the same thing we pay all other teachers. As a result, people like me are always going to be short math and science teachers because there's a different supply-demand curve. When my school district is short math and science teachers, the kids who suffer most are kids in high-poverty communities who get math and science teachers in the vernacular of our trade that are trying to stay a day ahead of the kids. But here's a clue, folks. You can't teach math and science staying a day ahead of the kids. And so if we don't use this money intelligently to say to great math and science teachers in New York City, look, we will pay you significantly more to go to Harlem, or to go to Central Brooklyn, or to go to the South Bronx, then it's not going to happen. And if the states don't help us, if we don't all put our shoulder against this wheel, then it's not going to happen. For the 7 years I've been chancellor, These are issues we have raised time and time again because we understand the fundamental inequities. And yet it's very hard, and the finger pointing, well, that's a regulatory issue, that's a collective bargaining issue, that's a legislative issue. What the hope is that this money will create leverage in the system so that we'll actually facilitate solutions, not simply sit back and issue edicts.
I think part of the solutions, Katie, is also joining that conversation that Joel alluded to earlier, is what are the roles that the different partners ought to play in this? Let's take the issue which he commented about, state has an obligation to put together systems of standards, assessment, and accountability. Now, we have accountability systems that in many of our states way over-identify underperformance. At least they over-identify it to the extent that it doesn't match up well with our capacity to remedy it. Mm-hmm. I've always been of the belief if we have state systems that identify underperforming schools, we ought only to identify them at levels at which we're capable of providing assistance to remedy the condition. If we over-identify, we're breaking down the regulatory system by virtue of being incapable of doing something about the underperformance we identify. Therefore, we destroy morale and destroy public confidence in the system. So we're trying to think in Massachusetts, what's a reasonable number? Let's match up our capacity with our accountability system in ways in which we can play a meaningful role coupled with the district, coupled with the superintendent in the district, to figure out what we do about a select number of underperforming schools and move them forward and use this money as a point of leverage for having that conversation and developing both statute and practices that support that.
Paul, knowing you as well as I do, when I hear you say something like that, it doesn't send chills through my bones. But there are certainly some other states where when the state leaders tell us there's nothing we can do about these schools that have underperformed for 2 decades because we don't have the capacity and they don't bother to try to build the capacity, I start getting very nervous. So, Joanne, talk with us a little bit about what's the idea behind the 5,000? Where did that come from? What are you expecting states and districts to do with these long-time low performers?
So the number of 5,000 comes from just looking at taking what we're calling the persistently lowest achieving schools, which are the bottom 5% of the schools that are in corrective action restructuring under Title I, and most of these schools have been in dire circumstances, as you pointed out, for decades. So 5,000 is the worst of the worst. It's not 5% of the schools in the country, it's 5% of the really bad schools in the country. So it's the bottom 5% of the worst schools that we've been dealing with. And I think that the contention that we have is that we can't improve or tinker our way to better schools in these places, and that one of the core competencies that district leaders should be developing is the ability to close down bad schools and open really good schools in their places. And this is something that I think some superintendents around the country do in fact believe is part of their job and have taken very seriously the notion of building new schools offices and learning how politically to close bad schools, because it's never a politically popular thing to do. Even the worst schools seem to have advocates who come out of the woodwork to support them. But powering through and having the political courage to close them down anyway and replace them with good schools and know what a good school looks like and how to actually put a good school in its place is a hard thing. I think that we believe that as a country, it's a challenge we have to take on, but we don't have great answers to it. It's one of the areas in the Race to the Top notice that we were criticized the most for being too prescriptive in. And the thing that I think we're all struggling with, not only at the department, but as a sector in general, is when you really don't know how to do something, do you get really unprescriptive and loose with it, or do you take all the best research, pile it on, and say, let's all put our efforts around trying these models for turning around really bad schools and hold ourselves highly accountable quickly for improvements? The question isn't 10 years from now, have we fixed it? It's for each school within 2 years, does it look different? Is it on a completely different trajectory? And if not, that one didn't work, let's try something else. So that's the concept behind it. One other thing I will say is that we are trying very hard to make sure from a federal point of view that all of the different programs we're designing, the school improvement grants, Race to the Top, the state stabilization funds, are all completely and consistently aligned behind the same things, so that all of the funds that schools and districts and states get for this are completely consistent and interchangeable, so that we're not putting different regulations on different pieces that are all designed around the same problem. So hopefully that will also help with a coherent strategy at state and districts for just experimenting with and turning around these schools.
So Paul and Joel, I want you to respond to what Joanne just said. So this is a very different federal approach to low-performing schools. It basically says your general improvement strategies are not going to work. You got to essentially restaff, close them down, and reopen. How does that play with what you think you know from your experience? Joel, you want to take that first?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Look, this is one of the wonderful things about the education world. We've been talking about turning around low-performing schools for so long. I had hair when the discussion began. So this is what
a really long time ago.
Thank you, Kate. Actually, I've been thinking since you said to Paul about sending chills down your back. So this is. I mean, look. In New York, not only do we salute it, we've done it. I have closed down, as Chancellor, close to 100 schools, most of them very, very low-performing, congenitally low-performing high schools. And it's not just been challenging or politically difficult, it's been worse than a root canal. I mean, it is because there's lots of attachments in there. But it seems to me quite clear that there comes a point where the culture of a school becomes so dysfunctional that your option is either start all over again or else acknowledge how much money you put in there, whatever things you're going to try to do are going to have at best small bore incremental change. And so we have replaced those 100 schools with about 350 new public schools, many are much smaller high schools. You used to have 3,000 kids in places like Bushwick High School or Evander Childs High School. They'd have a 30 or a 28% graduation rate, including local diplomas, which are no longer going to be acceptable. And we've opened in their stead in those buildings 5, 6 schools, which are getting much different and better outcomes. Now, is every one of our new schools, this is what I love the media, they immediately say, well, here's one of the new schools they opened, and it's not working, right? I promise you, if you open 350 new schools, some of them are not gonna work, I guarantee you. So your job then is to close them and close them and close them, but you've got to fundamentally create the capacity and pipeline. One of the things we're blessed in New York with, our Office of New Schools, now called our Portfolio Office, they have developed relationships with the private communities, all sorts of groups, from the Asia Society, from New Visions, from Outward Bound, that are partnering with us, bringing enormous new capacity. And one of the great fun things to do in New York is to sit in on interviews. We get hundreds of applicants each year for new school design. And when we open them, we're opening now some of the most innovative. We opened Quest to Learn a couple of months ago, which the department wouldn't have generated from within, had to come from external capacity, which is a complete 100% games, online and offline, theory approach of applied learning. One of the most powerful things I've seen in a long time. We've opened up a 9 to 14 school with CUNY. I've always thought we've got to integrate what we do, particularly on the career technical side, from high school and community colleges. Instead of saying they're two separate buckets, we need the full 6 years to be integrated. We opened one of those this year. Much, much more innovation coming into the system. And let me just give you 2 little anecdotes about school closings that I think are enormously informative. One, I was getting beat up by a whole bunch of political people for closing one of our schools. And in a private meeting, I said to them, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If any one of you or one of your friends will send your child there, I'll keep the school open. And now, that was the end of that discussion. Then I had another discussion. You can see why they need to send me to charm school. I had another discussion with somebody who was really tough on me for closing the school down. And I said, it was in his school district. And I said to him, here's exactly what we'll do. I'll keep that school open. I'm going to take all the teachers at the school that's a very high-performing school in your district, and I'm going to send them to that school. And I'm going to take all the teachers at that school and send it to the high-performing school, and then we keep both of them open. And he immediately said to me, you got to be crazy, man. And I said to him, think what you're saying. Teachers that will teach at that school for high-poverty kids, that's okay. But those teachers can't teach kids in a middle-class neighborhood. That's not okay. So these equity issues are fundamentally at the heart of the challenge. And what every school system has done in every city and in every state is to take the highest needs kids and typically dump them into these 5% or the worst of the worst or whatever you want to call, and then let them fend for themselves. And if you don't have a multi-level strategy in New York, every kid chooses his or her high school right down a list. They put in their first choice, second choice, third choice. And I'm pretty glad to say that something like 80% of our kids get one of their top 5 choices. That's led to much more equity. Opening up new schools has led to much more equity in the system.
Joel, you are a powerful reminder that attorneys do occasionally have some useful thing to add here. Paul, let me flip it to you, though.
Just say, this is Washington, D.C. The oldest line in the world, Katie, is why did they stop using mice and start using lawyers at the National Institute of Health? And the answer is there's many more lawyers around and you don't get too attached to them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Paul, Joel's sketched out a strategy that many folks have come to believe is a particularly effective strategy in an urban setting, but have raised questions about, can we, some of the historically low-performing schools are not in big urban centers, and how do you think about this kind of strategy for a state that has some urban centers and some rural and small towns?
Oh, I mean, we have a lot of small urban centers with high concentrations of poverty and lots of underperforming schools. I mean, one of the most striking things that we look at when we look at our data after a decade and a half of billions of dollars and lots of hard work and reform and doing quite well with our averages is that there's still this ironclad correlation between poverty and educational attainment and achievement. And we have exceptions, and obviously your work is all built around this. But on average, what we're doing for most kids in terms of mainstream schooling isn't sufficient to overcome the disadvantages of poverty. And so this comes to this whole question, and when we're talking about turnaround, about the challenge of policy and practice here. Do we know what to do? Can what we do be contained in our current conception of schooling, which is still, I would argue, for the most part, a one-size-fits-all early 20th century model? And what people like Joel, I see, are trying to do at the district level is to hybridize the school system and develop mechanisms of educating children that meet each child where he or she is in early childhood and give them what they need to move through the school system and be college and career ready by the time they graduate. And I think that's going to take a very different kind of delivery system. And so we're working hard in Massachusetts. We've just introduced legislation for something called readiness schools, which are designed to open up the system and bring in different modalities of delivery and build out the school day and build out the school year and give teachers more prerogative.